Are you able to share your screen, or are you having?
I'm still having some difficulty.
What about now?
Let me try now. Okay, there's video. Oh, and I think share screen is going to work now. Okay, great.
Yes.
All right, well, thank you. As Julie mentioned, the title of my presentation, or the topic, is Utilizing Item Analysis Assessment to Improve Learning and Instruction. And I am Dr. Jamie Four. I am an educational psychologist at Lock Haven University. What my goals are for this session is I want to introduce item analysis. Item analysis is a statistical method of analyzing multiple choice questions. It's really a quite simple and powerful tool that instructors can use, and I have used, to improve student learning as well as improve my own teaching. So I'm going to go over what item analysis is, the two statistics that we get, which indicate question difficulty and question effectiveness, known as discrimination. I'm also going to talk briefly about constructing effective multiple choice questions, because question construction is an important component for item analysis to work properly. And then again, I'm going to talk about some research-based effective methods that we can use to improve learning and instruction, and also share some of the methods that I have used over the years that I have assessed and analyzed test questions. Okay, so what I'm going to do again first here is talk about the two statistics that we get. And one is a basic statistic that we can get really from any test software, and that is item difficulty, referred to as the P value. So in terms of item difficulty of test questions, the general consensus in research, test research, is that the ideal difficulty is between 0.3 and 0.7, which means 30% of your class gets the question correct, up to 70% of the class getting the question correct. Okay, so this is a total class statistic for each individual question on a test or exam. So why is ideal P between this 30% and 70% level? Well, if it's too high, an easy question, and I'm just going to pop up here some of the general consensus of classifying questions in terms of their difficulty level based on the percent correct. So we have 91 to 100, generally considered easy, 61 to 90% class average, considered moderate, 21 to 60 difficult, and 0 to 20% difficult. While really high or low class averages on a question tell us little about student performance or student knowledge on those topics and questions. And in a little bit, I'm going to show you just some sample data that I received from test results. But generally, if a question's easy, you're not really assessing whether students know versus whether they don't know the question. If it's 100%, then essentially we don't know. Is it just an easy question? Maybe this is a question or topic that we really shouldn't include on an exam because students already have that knowledge. Or if it's too difficult, that not very many students in the class are getting it, then that can indicate, again, a problem with the question, or it may also indicate that this is not something that we've taught or content that we've covered appropriately. All right, so item difficulty is the first statistic that we get. Then the second statistic that we get, I find a little more interesting. I like both statistics, but this is item discrimination. Item discrimination really reflects how are the students who performed well on the test doing on that question versus the students who are not performing well on the test. Now it compares high versus low scoring students. And it's not, you don't have to put in who are your good students, who is not performing well. The test performance will do that. So what this item discrimination calculates, and this is the D ratio, is D item discrimination compares the upper 27% of scorers on a test versus the lower 27% of scorers on a test for each individual question. So just as an example here, let's say we have 37 students. 37 students will make my math work out good here. The top 27% will be 10, the 10 top scorers on the exam. The bottom 27% will be the lowest 10 scorers on the exam out of these 37 students. So let's say out of the top 10 students, that 7 out of the 10 got it correct. Okay, that's a 70%. And out of the bottom 10 students, 2 out of 10 got it correct. So that's a 20%. What the item discrimination would end up being is 0.5. Okay, so indicating that 70% minus 20% of the upper versus lower students got the question correct. So the larger the number for the item discrimination, also whether it's positive or negative, an item discrimination number can also be negative as well, indicates the value of the question. Again, that more students who have the knowledge, who are performing well on the test, did well and got this question. And those students who are not performing well, do not have the knowledge for this content, are not getting the question correct. All right, so that's item discrimination. Now, depending on what item analysis software you use, and I've used 3 different software programs over my career, so some of the data I'm going to show you throughout this session comes from different variations of software that I've used. But there's also another statistic you may get along with the D item discrimination, or maybe you get it instead of the item discrimination. And it's called the point biserial index. And what this is if we had 37 students taking the test, it would calculate the correlation of every item with the final score on the test for every test taker. So it's not comparing the bottom 27% versus the top 27%. It's an index of all participants taking the test. So which one do you use? Well, I've used both. A lot of times these numbers, the D ratio and the point biserial, will come out very close, but they're both perfectly fine to use for item discrimination. All right, so again, what does item discrimination tells us? Well, a positive D, again, these numbers can range from negative 1 to positive 1, tells us whether the item is discriminating between knowledgeable students versus less knowledgeable students. And here I just have some general consensus on how to interpret the item discrimination index. And you'll see these either as decimals or percentages. Again, I've used different software over the years that have shown them in both or either way. So a discrimination index of 0.4, 1 and above is considered a very strong item that's highly effective. So my example in the previous slide of a 0.5, that's really good item discrimination between those who know versus those who don't know on a test. And again, 0.21 to 0.4, generally considered medium, 0 to 0.2, low effectiveness, and a negative question is ineffective. So when we analyze the data from our assessments, we want to pay attention and look at those questions which are scoring in the low or negative ineffective ranges. All right, so on this slide, I present just a sampling of questions that I've received from test results. And so what I do when I first get my sample of questions, I go straight to the discrimination and the difficulty indexes. And what we're seeing here on this slide, 8 questions. I have the question number, and then each question had 4 alternatives in the multiple choice question. The correct alternative is listed, or I color coded in purple. It has the asterisk. So that's actually the item difficulty. So A was the correct answer for number one. 82% of students got it correct. That is the item difficulty. Then we can see the discrimination column, and there we have some numbers from a negative 0.20, 0, all the way up to a phenomenal 0.87. So again, as I look at this data analysis right here, what I'm going to focus on is a combination of both difficulty and discrimination. So I have a couple very easy questions, but I also have a couple very difficult questions. And then I have two questions that are coming out as essentially ineffective, a negative 0.20 and a 0.00. So of my concern looking at this data, well, question number one looks pretty good. It's medium difficulty, good discrimination. Question number two, I'm concerned about. That is a very difficult question. 23% got it correct. However, I'm initially encouraged because the discrimination index is, again, very high, 0.48. So I look at C is the correct response for that one. And the 77% of students who got it incorrect chose option A. All right, and you see a little negative sign there by that 77%. That indicates that more of the low scores on the overall exam score chose option A. So that's why that negative is showing up. So this is a question, again, I took a closer look at, and I've used this question for at least 15 years. And how I approach it now is this is a difficult question, but it's very good. So why are so many students missing it? And as I analyzed the questions, tried different things, I thought about changing some of the language in the question. So some of the language was a little technical. And this was it was a child development question about preterm versus small for date babies. But what I really had to do with this question was go back to my instruction and improve it. So I changed my instruction. I had a class discussion. I also gave a sample problem similar to this question that students answered, and then we talked about. And, now more currently, this question is scoring around 56% with a similar level of discrimination. Okay, question number 4 is very problematic. Essentially, it's just guessing. We have mid to upper 20% for the correct answer D, as well as the other 3 options. There's no discrimination. So this question either really needs fixed or it just needs dropped. Then I'm looking at question number 5. It's essentially everyone got it correct, and it has a low discrimination index. So, I question the value of this, of having it on the exam, because everyone's getting it correct, and really probably one of the top scorers probably missed that with that selection D being a positive there. So very low discrimination index. Again, I need to look at revising or just dropping that question. Number 7 and 8. 7 is an easy question. However, it has a great discrimination index. And so this is a question that, I can live with being an easy question because everyone who missed it, and they've selected options B, C, and D, were the lowest scoring students. And then question number 8, that question looks very confusing. And that question is one where, and actually I had 2 questions that have happened like this. One, I really didn't describe the concept well enough. And then the other question that I had that was similar to this, just the concepts for the correct answer B and the one response C that most students chose, they were just really very close and kind of indistinguishable. So I had to fix that question and also look at it again during my instruction. All right, so again, that's just some analysis I can make looking at the data before I even really look at the questions, can kind of get a sense of what's going on. And a little later, I'll look at some specific questions and some of the decisions that I made. All right, so as we look at item analysis, some of the reasons that we may get low discrimination on an item, well, first we just need to check, is everything okay in our system or scoring key? Is it scored correctly? Is the correct answer, the right answer? So is there some kind of technical error that we made? But more likely than not, it's one of these following two reasons. It may be a poorly constructed item. Maybe it's a confusing question. Students are confused what to answer, and one of the incorrect distractors looks more enticing than the correct response. Or maybe, like with my one question that I had a problem with in that number 8 example, multiple answers, really could have been correct. Or something that I find often is that, maybe I just didn't teach the content the way I wanted students to learn it. So maybe I taught it at a lower level and I asked a higher level question, or maybe I just didn't go over it in depth enough with students or often enough. So that's another common reason why we get low item discrimination. All right, so here briefly, I just want to look at what is the key to developing good multiple choice questions. Here I have an example of a question. A multiple choice question has 3 main parts. The stem, that's the question itself. So these should be written clearly. They should only have one question, not a double-barreled where you're not sure what the question exactly is asking. Then we have alternatives. And here I have 4 alternatives. One is the correct answer. And in this case, this is selection B. So what's chiefly responsible for life expectancy increase the last 50 years? It's reduction of death rate among infants and young children. And then there are 3 distractor items with this, or choices with this question. So here's the key to writing a good multiple choice question. We have the stem, which is the question itself, that has to be well written. We have the answer that matches, what is chiefly responsible, but the distractors need to be plausible. So in this case, all 3 of these distractors contribute to an increase in life expectancy, but not to the rate that the reduction in infants and young children deaths did. Okay, so plausible distractors are the key to effective multiple choice assessments. And there's been a lot of research on just how important multiple choice or the distractors are to these types of questions. So when we have plausible distractors, it reduces the chance of guessing. So you think, well, if we increase the number of distractors, maybe instead of 3, we have 4 or we have 5, then it's going to be less likely that students are able to guess. But that's not necessarily true. It depends on the quality of the distractors. So adding distractors just for the sake of adding distractors does not improve the question or does not reduce the chance of guessing. So chance of guessing, if we have good distractors that could be logical alternatives, guessing is lower than, say, if we have, the correct answer and 3 distractors, 4 options, we would think, well, 25% chance students could get the correct answer. But if all the distractors are plausible, then students' chance of getting that correct answer is actually much less than 25%. Okay, plausible distractors also help identify students who lack understanding because, they're not sure what the correct answer is. All or several responses look plausible to them. And it's the distractors that also give opportunities for valuable in-depth feedback in terms of, well, why was B the correct answer in that previous question and not A, C, and D? So there's a lot to talk about there depending on which distractors the majority of students selected with that question. All right, so, again, item analysis is utilized in multiple choice testing. And so, now I'm just going to deviate slightly here, and there are many benefits to using multiple choice testing in the classroom. One of those benefits is that we can assess learning at many levels of complexity. So we can assess levels or learning at application, comprehension, evaluation, and so on, synthesis. Multiple choice questions can be created for complex learning. So here's just a couple examples that I have. I'm not going to read these questions, but this one is essentially a case study that I could put into my testing software system. Students have to choose, well, which of these scenarios here on student learning matches the performance approach goal orientation. This is a motivation question. Okay. And so the response here was response D. 56% of the students got it correct. It had a great item analysis on this instance that I gave this question. And we can see from the distractors that, students selected all these distractors. So this is a good higher level question, and it performed really well. Just kind of another example I have here. This question was in a research methods class. So students had to interpret and analyze the results of a longitudinal study. And then they had to evaluate, well, what can this researcher conclude from this type of result? Okay. So in this case, the correct response was C. 79% got it correct, a good item discrimination. The only issue I had here with this question is selection A was the only other option that students chose. And so 21% there. So my distractors, one was working well, but the other two distractors really didn't add much to this question. Okay, so, I go back then and look, well, how could I improve distractors B and D, which no one selected? Okay. Another advantage of multiple choice testing, especially versus other more long form testing formats, is that, in an hour testing session or 50 minutes, you can give 50 to 60 questions. So you can test a large knowledge base in a short time. And the more questions you have, that improves the overall validity of the assessment because you're assessing more content. And then another major benefit, and this has really been an area of research that has exploded over the past couple of decades, is the testing effect or retrieval practice. The more students are assessed, and the more they're assessed with multiple choice tests that are well written and have good distractors, it forces students to retrieve knowledge from their knowledge base, their schemas during these testing sessions, and it has led to long-term improvements in retrieval. Okay, so it increases opportunities the more students take tests, and having good distractors and quality questions are an important component of this. All right, so what do I do to improve learning and instruction with my assessments? Well, I evaluate my assessments on two major levels. First is the question level. I look for problems in item construction. If a question is extremely difficult or has low discrimination, I evaluate item difficulty and discrimination, and I do so together, kind of like I did on that slide where I showed those 8 sample questions. I'm looking for those questions that A, have low discrimination, but B, are either easy with low discrimination or very difficult with low discrimination. And then I can identify misunderstanding clues from the distractors. As long as the question is written well, then I can look at those distractors and which distractors are the students who got it wrong? What are they selecting? What are they being attracted to? And so what can I do to improve that? Either in fixing the question or more likely addressing my instruction. And then a second level I look at is many of my courses, of course, I have learning objectives. They might be per lesson or for a unit. I look at all the questions that address a particular objective. Some of my classes, we meet standards in the field of psychology or maybe university standards in terms of general education. So I'll group the results of questions by objective and or standard. And I'll see, do these questions sufficiently address the objective or standard? And I'll evaluate the group difficulty and effectiveness. Now, not difficulty and discrimination of each question, but of the group of questions. So I'm going to show examples of these here in the next sections. All right, so my question level evaluation, just here are actual questions now. And these are questions that I've discussed with the after we've taken the exam because I wanted to address some of the issues. This first one deals with a Piagetian developmental concept of schema development. And with this question, when I got the data, I was happy with the discrimination index. It's 0.44, the point by serial is 0.422 or 42. But I was surprised that only 51.5% of the students got it correct. So I think it was 18 out of 35. I wondered, this question shouldn't be this difficult. Why was it? And so I discussed with the class in reviewing this question. What were you focused on? And you can see here, students selected each of the 3 distractors. The one they selected the most is actually a concept from a different theory, that by Lev Vygotsky. But the students had indicated that, it says her ability to use word processing program. And the way I instructed it, I just talked about knowledge acquisition when I was talking about schema development, not a skill or ability. Okay? So that is something that I've changed in my instruction. I now give more examples, talk about it being increasing knowledge, but also skills and ability. And in more recent iterations of this question, I have seen it improve up to about 15% more. Okay, this next question just kind of followed up question number 1, and I was happy to see here that students scored 74% correct here, so that was good. They understood the difference between Piaget's accommodation versus assimilation. The discrimination index down here, 0.33, that's perfectly fine as well. My issue with this question is, well, no one selected alternatives or distractors C and D. So I've gone back and I removed one of them and kind of merged the two so that to see if more students would select it. I haven't found that to be the case yet. So, I still evaluate this question. All right, just a few more examples here. This question had a negative discrimination index. This one deals with theories in research. And so, theories, their main purpose is to predict, but some of the good students down here chose item D. And again, I had this negative discrimination index. So that meant that the top performing students were not selecting A as much as they were D here when I discussed this question. So I also talked about how this was an education course, applying research and theories from laboratory to real world. And that's what confused some of these students. So again, I addressed that after the exam, after we've taken the test, but now that's something that I'm going to address in the future. Okay. This question was actually very good. A discrimination index of 0.58, which is very high. But I was again concerned about the difficulty. It was very difficult. Only 46% of the students got this. This was from an intro to psych class. And so again, I discussed this with the class. Why did so many pick discriminator C? That was kind of the main alternative for those students, for many of the students. And they were just having a hard time distinguishing these 2 theories with the way I asked the question. So this is a question that I've had to modify the wording a little. And also with this topic right here, I've adapted my instruction to kind of include an activity with this, as well as just provide more real life examples to the students. All right, and then this final one. This one, it didn't have a negative discrimination, so it was 0.33, that's good. But I was really confused looking at the data because I thought, well, 60% got it right, that's good. But then I noticed, oh, only 11% got it correct. Okay, so this one I really had to address with the class, and this is, it's again a concept in Piagetian learning. I had to go back and, just address how I covered this topic in my lessons because students weren't seeing the point that I wanted them to see. All right, so that's my individual level question analysis. Now what I look at as well is objective level evaluation. So this is an example of looking at the learning objectives for the course, for the lesson. And this is, again, relates to Piaget's cognitive development theory. Objective number 1, what processes are involved in learning? I have 6 questions that address that. How does learning develop with age? I have 5 questions addressing that. How do we apply Piaget's theory to teaching? I have 3 questions in the exam addressing that. So this is called a table of specifications, and it's just a really nice visual and organizing tool to demonstrate either to myself, which is my main purpose, or maybe I need to demonstrate it to department or university assessment committees. How am I assessing this? What evidence do I have that students are meeting the objectives? So I have my question averages. I also look at the discriminations, and look at potentially fixing some of the questions that may need fixed. I also apply a cognitive category. Here I'm just applying basic factual, conceptual, applied. You can categorize your questions to Bloom's taxonomy if that's appropriate for you. But I illustrate, I have different levels of difficulty. I also am assessing different cognitive categories in my assessment of these learning objectives. And then there's a discrimination to show that, I'm effectively doing this. All right, so that's objective level. This next screen just shows standard level. Here are the standards that I'm meeting. And for this class, this was a research methods. It met general education standards of learning, concepts in the discipline, learning application. And again, same thing here. I can just provide the evidence. Well, here's how I'm assessing students. Here's the results of this data. And our cut point was 70%. So for all 3 of these criteria, students met the minimum level of expected performance. All right. So to wrap up, in terms of improving learning and improving instruction, some just general recommendations, research, but also some of my own. This one's more research-based. Just give low-stake practice quizzes. Give students lots of opportunities to take assessments, to take quizzes. Use them in the class as well. So not just your summative assessments, but also more formative in those learning processing assessments. And another thing that I do with my practice quizzes is I space them out by chapters or chapter sections so that each week students are doing a quiz. And what that does is it allows them to engage in spaced study or distributed practice, meaning they're not studying everything just the night before the exam. They're studying it over several days or a few weeks. Another finding from the research is make sure that you're assessing higher level knowledge and skills, especially with multiple choice questions. If, you should assess what you teach. I'm going to talk about that on the next slide. But assessing higher level knowledge and skills, it requires more effort for students to complete these types of assessments, but they're getting that retrieval benefit when they're being challenged with questions. So when you get your quiz exam results, make sure you look at the difficulty levels. Are they difficult enough, but not being too difficult? And then these higher level questions, like some examples that I showed you on the previous slides, provide great opportunities for feedback in the class to find out what misunderstandings students had and how we could remediate that. And then also to improve student learning, just encourage students to utilize quizzing themselves as a study strategy. It's a high effort strategy that, again, with that testing effect or retrieval practice effect, has been found to be one of the best study strategies versus other ones. All right, so, and when they are quizzing, not just to get the grade if you're giving points for these quizzes, but reinforce the value of reflection and monitoring. These are metacognitive skills. So reflecting, well, what knowledge do I know versus don't know? Which questions am I getting? Which ones am I missing? Monitoring, what gaps do I have in my knowledge? All right, and then finally for improving instruction, some, again, general literature recommendations. Identify your assessments before designing the instruction. There's a design method called the backward design, where we start with our learning objectives, we pick our assessments, and then we develop our instruction. So make sure we align instruction to meet our learning goals and needs of the course. Again, just assess frequently. So giving these low stakes, formative, in the class practice types of assessments gives students lots of opportunities. Challenge them with higher level knowledge and skills that you're teaching in the class, and then address misunderstandings with the feedback. And then finally, I look through all this data. I may adapt instruction based on the data that I see, especially if it's from a practice test. If it's from a summative test, a more formal unit or final test, then, I really note that to go back into my instruction and address those instructional gaps and weaknesses. But I'm doing so based on assessment data. All right, so that's my presentation for this afternoon. Here's some helpful references that talk about this theory. Okay, so I see we have a few questions.
Yes, we do have a few questions. The first one, do you believe multiple choice questions are effective for math?
Yeah, I think they can be, especially in terms of assessing problem solving types of skills. So, there's research about just the general overall effectiveness of multiple choice questions, but there's lots of research in terms of the effectiveness of math as well. So again, this problem solving, but also conceptual knowledge in math. Math is one area where, effective findings have occurred.
And the next one, how can we design multiple choice questions for math such that students can't back into the answer? By working backwards, they are not necessarily understanding the concepts being taught.
Okay, so you're thinking about reversing, kind of reverse engineering those types of assessments. My expertise is not necessarily in math design questions, more so psychology and social sciences. But one of the key things would be just avoid asking questions like that, so that you're not asking a question that a student can answer through reverse engineering the calculation. But that's something that, I would suggest looking through the math literature in terms of multiple choice effectiveness. Because again, there are lots of studies out there talking about how to design good multiple choice assessments.
Thank you, Dr. Ford. The next one is, do you have an opinion on the effectiveness of multiple choice questions taken from a publisher's test data bank?
Yeah, I definitely do. So again, in the field of psychology, and being an educational psychologist are involved in the design and creation of assessment items. So, I've known colleagues or professors of mine who have written test manuals for textbooks. So it may be discipline dependent, but I've found, you can get good questions from publisher test banks, but you do have to definitely be aware. Most of the questions in publisher test banks, or the majority, can be low-level assessment items. So oftentimes I find myself modifying the language used in those questions because maybe my students, that's just not familiar language. I often find that the distractors may not be, plausible distractors. So I may often change distractors. But again, I found good questions through publishers' websites, but just watch out for lower level assessment items.
Thank you, Dr. Ford. We did have an instructor ask if you could go back one slide. So if you could put up your PowerPoint presentation.
Yes, and which slide? Is it that one?
Is this the correct slide for you, Christine? Yes, she said yes, it is.
Oh, okay, great.
All right. And for those who are asking about the PowerPoint presentation, Dr. Ford, if you would like to share that PowerPoint presentation with attendees, you can email that to our marketing team and we can send that out to them as soon as we get everything finalized for IEM.
Sure, I will do that.
And I also had another instructor ask if you can go back one more slide.
Sure.
From here. Is this the correct slide? Yes, it looks like this might be the right one. If you have any other questions, just go ahead and type them into the Q&A below. All right. It looks like those are all of our questions for today. Thank you, Dr. Ford, for sharing this valuable information with us today. The next concurrent session will begin at 3 p.m. Eastern. You can view the chat for session meeting room links or access the conference website for a complete list of concurrent sessions and their descriptions. While accessing the conference website, don't forget to swing by the virtual exhibit hall to say hello to the Hawks team. While there, you can view a quick 5-minute demonstration, request your t-shirt, and be entered to win a $50 hourly giveaway. Also, in the spirit of St. Patrick's Day, you'll find a few golden coins throughout the conference website. Click on the coins to be entered to win an additional raffle. We will see you at the next session. Thank you, Dr. Ford.
Thank you.